Hey folks, welcome to week 2 of our AP exam review. So this is going to be module 2 this week, and we are going to be covering what AP refers to as Unit 1. So we're back to the very beginning of the course, talking about foundations of democracy, the basic building blocks of our system of government. In this set of notes today, we're going to cover 3 objectives. We're going to talk about how basic ideals of democracy are found in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We're going to talk about 3 models of representative democracy that the Founding Fathers debated and included in different elements of our system. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how Federalists and Anti-Federalists differed in their view of what the best system of government would be for us. So our first objective, and I'm taking all these elements directly from the AP syllabus. I'm trying to boil things down to exactly what they have required you to know for the AP exam. So first objective of this section is explain how democratic ideals are reflected in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, obviously 2 of our most important founding documents. So the theoretical foundations for our system of government, talking about what our Founding Fathers believed in. First of all of these ideas can be found under the broad heading of limited government. The government has specific limits on what it is able to do. So some examples of that. Natural rights. This is an idea believed in by a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers, most notably John Locke. A lot of these things made their way into our founding documents, but natural rights are the idea that we have certain rights that are not dependent on the laws or customs of any particular culture of government, but just as human beings, we are endowed with these basic rights that cannot be violated by any government, including things like life, liberty, and property. Popular sovereignty, the idea that government is created by people and subject to the will of people. Republicanism, simply the idea that we founded a system of government that's based on democracy, in which the people are indirectly represented by elected representatives. So we're not talking direct democracy where all the citizens are voting on everything. We're talking about elected officials that we choose making those policy decisions for us. And then finally, the social contract, which is the idea, kind of the basic theoretical foundation for why people have governments at all. It's the idea that people agree to be governed by entering into an implicit contract. They agree to give up some of their freedoms in exchange for protection and services that are provided by the government. So as we go through these things, hopefully there's some things percolating in your brain as far as how are these things actually found in our system of government and in some of our founding documents. So I could definitely see them asking you about that type of thing on the exam and an essay question. Okay, let's talk a little bit about those 2 founding documents that we referenced earlier. The Declaration of Independence, of course, signed in 1776. Keep in mind, the Declaration of Independence was issued after the Revolutionary War had already begun in 1775, so we are already fighting at this point. It's drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson with some assistance from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And it, of course, asserted our independence from Britain. And within the Declaration of Independence, most of the body of that document is a long list of grievances that we had with the British government that had led us to revolt from them. And it really forms a foundation for popular sovereignty. It talks a lot in that document about how the people need to provide their consent and need to be the source of the power for the government. Then the Constitution, 1787, was written at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which was chaired by George Washington, our future president, drafted primarily by James Madison, who is known as the father of the Constitution, but also with assistance from Alexander Hamilton and a larger group of framers known as the Grant Committee. It establishes really what was a very unique form of government in the world at that time, still is somewhat today. And basically, at its core, it's a blueprint for our government, for the institutions and the powers of our government. Okay, so coming back to what we said a few minutes ago, these ideas that our founding fathers or framers of our Constitution believed in these ideas of limited government, things like natural rights, popular sovereignty, republicanism, social contract. I wanted to give you some concrete examples of how these things actually show up in our founding documents, specifically in these two that we're looking at closely here, the Declaration and the Constitution. Natural rights, probably the best example of where that appears in our founding documents is in the Declaration of Independence. I have a quote here. Jefferson writes that all men are created equal, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a direct reference to natural rights. And then in the Constitution, we have some references, not quite as explicit, but we have lots of things included in the Constitution that are protections of individual rights, things that should not be violated or taken away by a government, like habeas corpus. You can't just be imprisoned without cause. The Bill of Rights that were later added to the Constitution, of course, protect a lot of basic rights for people, or civil liberties. How about popular sovereignty? In the Declaration of Independence, they talk about governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So there, again, we have a very direct reference to that idea that the people are the source of the power. In the Constitution, simply the idea that people are the ultimate source of the power. Some of our representatives in government are directly elected by us. Some of them are indirectly selected, but ultimately, for just about everybody in the government, they are at least indirectly selected by the people. Republicanism, of course, the whole Constitution lays out a Republican system of government, also requires that all of our state governments must have Republican forms of government. And the social contract, good example of that in the Declaration of Independence. Here another quote: to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. So there we have reference to what happens if a government violates the basic social contract. The people have the right to overthrow it. And of course, in this case, they're talking about overthrowing British rule because the founders felt that they had violated the social contract. Okay, the Constitution, just wanted to give a brief overview of that. This is the same organizer that I had given you guys as part of those first 10 days of work when the schools first closed. But going through the original 7 articles of the Constitution, the first article outlines the legislative branch, which we know as Congress, and it includes in there a list of its enumerated powers, things like the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Commerce Clause. Article 2 goes into the executive branch, or the presidency, including a description of how presidents are selected through the Electoral College. Article 3 talks about the judicial branch, or court system at the national level. Really only lays out specifics for the Supreme Court at that time, but grants Congress the ability to create additional federal courts as needed. That would be lesser than the Supreme Court. So those first 3 articles are the institutions of government. Article 4 talks about how states are supposed to interact with each other. Full faith and credit clause, privileges and immunities clause, things like that. Also rules for how new states could be added in the future to the Union, and a guarantee, here again we have a reference to Republican government, that all state governments must be Republican in form. Article 5 talks about how the Constitution can be amended in the future. And just a brief review of that, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress or a national constitutional convention that's called by 2/3 of the states. And then once amendments are proposed, they have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Article 6 talks about the supremacy of the Constitution, federal laws and treaties over all other aspects of law, and also specifies that there can be no religious test for public officials. Article 7 talks about how the original Constitution would be ratified. They needed 9 states to ratify it. So that's the original document. Shortly thereafter, 1791, the first Congress in the United States proposes the Bill of Rights amendments, the first 10 amendments, which include our civil liberties. And then following that, starting in 1795 and then going up all the way through as recent as 1992, we have added amendments 11 through 27. All right, on to Objective 2. So now we are tasked with explaining how the models of representative democracy are visible in major institutions, policies, events, or debates in the United States. So, there are three major models of how a representative democracy can function. So these are three models. Two of them we really talked about a lot earlier in the year in my class. We talked about pluralism and elite theory. Didn't so much talk about, by name anyway, participatory democracy, but these are really, from AP's perspective, the three models that our founding fathers believed in most and incorporated into our different institutions of government, different practices. So they're pretty simple. Participatory democracy is the idea that institutions of government should be as open and the policymaking process should be as directly related to the will of the people as possible. Pluralist democracy is a little bit more removed from the people, more based on group-based activism by non-government interests, things like political parties and interest groups and things like that, striving for impact on the political decision-making process. And then finally, elite democracy is the furthest removed from the will of the people, most restrictive form of democracy, which emphasizes much more limited participation in politics and civil society. So down at their bottom, I added this note that our founding fathers had competing philosophies on this. Some believe more in the participatory model, some believe more in the pluralist or elite democracy models. And they incorporated elements of all three of these into our institutions. So again, another example of something they may be likely to ask you about on an FRQ on the exam would be where exactly you can find examples of these in our institutions of government. So let's talk about that. Okay, so first of all, and this is something, before we get to some concrete examples in our institutions, let's talk about some of the different documents that were part of the debate in our early founding period and how they exemplify the belief in these different models. So specifically, the syllabus asks you to consider the U.S. Constitution, Federalist number 10, and Brutus 1 in terms of how these reflect the tensions between the broad participatory model and the more filtered pluralist and elite models. So the Constitution has really elements of both. So if you think about the House of Representatives, that's the one part of our government that was originally directly elected by the people. So that's really the closest thing in our Constitution to participatory model. It's directly elected, it's supposed to reflect the will of the majority, the will of the people, pretty close to participatory model. Other parts of our system, much more in line with the pluralist slash elitist models that are more filtered. So the executive, of course, is elected indirectly by the Electoral College. The courts are unelected. The Senate originally was selected not by the people, but by state legislatures. So these are much more in line with the pluralist and elite view of democracy. Federalist number 10, this is one of the Federalist essays written in support of the new Constitution versus the Articles of Confederation. Federalist 10 focuses on concern about the dangers of majority factions. And so in support of protecting ourselves from those, it advocates for separating the people a little bit from policymaking decisions, distancing it from the people via elected representatives. So the way we can protect ourselves from the mob, so to speak, is by having elected representatives making decisions instead of the people themselves. So it cast in that way, it's a little bit more on the side of pluralist slash elitist theory. Brutus number 1 is more on the participatory side. This is one of the anti-federalist papers arguing that this new centralized national government was too large, too consolidated, too powerful. It would threaten the rights and the liberties of the people. And so instead of that, Brutus number 1 and the anti-federalists are advocating for keeping policymaking closer to the people at the state level. So they want the people to be more directly involved, more majority rule. And so that is much more in line with the participatory model. Okay, now these tensions continue to be part of our debates today. So for example, I just wanted to give you some concrete examples that I came up with on my own of how these things have continued to persist. We still have these debates between giving more power to the people versus separating it from the people a little bit. So some examples of these: voting rights. Lots of ongoing debate about how easy or difficult it should be to register to vote voting itself, the rights of felons, for example, how easy it should be for them to get their voting rights restored, voter ID laws, things like that. How simple and easy should it be for people to partake in that process of voting and have their will expressed versus separating it a little bit and making it more difficult. Debates over the roles of lobbyists and interest groups. How easy should it be for them to have their point of view represented and expressed in government, or should we have strict rules on them? Gerrymandering, that process of redistricting congressional districts for political purposes. Does that process make congressional districts unrepresentative of the will of the people? Lifetime terms for federal judges, which of course we have in our Constitution, but you're starting to hear more and more people arguing that maybe that makes them a little bit too distant from the will of the people, that we should put time limits on how long Supreme Court justices and other federal judges can serve on the bench so that they're more in line and in tune with the will of the people. All right, on to our final objective for this section: explain how Federalists and Anti-Federalist views on centralized government and democracy are reflected in the foundational documents of the United States. So first of all, the Federalists, just a quick review, the Federalists were a group of people that were in favor of this new Constitution that would replace the Articles of Confederation. So they favored a much stronger, more centralized national government that would include robust protections against the tyranny of the majority. People like James Madison, other Federalists, were very, very fearful, concerned about putting too much power in the hands of the majority directly, that would lead to tyranny, that would lead to the trampling of other people's rights. So in Federalist 10, we referenced this document earlier, one of the Federalist essays, again, focuses on the dangers of factions, which are groups of people that have common political purposes, can become dangerous. And he argued that for the superiority of a large republic such as ours, in terms of controlling the mischiefs of factions. He said, can't really do anything. It would be a bad idea and not really practical to prevent factions from forming in the first place. But when you have a large republic like the United States would be under the Constitution, as opposed to all these separate little mini republics in the states, that would be a good way of controlling factions. And that achieves that in two ways. First of all, authority in a Republican form of government is delegated to elected representatives rather than the people themselves. So there again, we have a good example of pluralist and elite theory of democracy rather than participatory. And then also, power will be dispersed among the national government and state governments. So there we have an early preview of federalism, which we'll talk about later on this week. On the other side of things, we have the anti-federalists. They were opposed to this new Constitution. They favored more the system that had existed under the Articles of Confederation, which was more of a participatory style of democracy. The power is located more closely to the people themselves, where you had strong state governments and a very weak national government. So the anti-federalist essays are referred to as the Brutus essays, and in Brutus 1, the author promotes this idea of participatory democracy, where the people should have more of the power. Talks about the benefits of having small, decentralized republics, such as the state governments, and warned very robustly about the dangers to personal liberty from a large, centralized government. So there we have that. This will conclude today's discussion. Tomorrow we'll get into more of the foundations of democracy.